So it's come to my attention that every work of art has a miraculous story behind it, this flow of inspiration that just continues on and on until eventually a masterpiece is born. Well, I made this. Yes, one day a presumably small version of me sat down in what I'm pretty sure was my kitchen, painted what I believe to be are some fireworks, and that's just about all I remember. It's a great story, I know. But listen, it's entirely possible that I've just forgotten the longer, more impactful version of that story. After all, it's extremely unlikely that I've retained any information from that long ago. Or maybe my mind has developed and changed so much to a point where I've simply lost touch. While I'm sure that as of now, many of you wouldn't even begin to describe yourselves this way, the fact is we were all born creative, each and every one of us. It's when we get older, however, that our creativity levels begin to decline. And if you think about it, it makes complete sense. Like, raise your hand if you have the time to make art, any art, on a daily basis, excluding artists. Okay. But now I want you to think back to how you'd answer that question when you were 5. I expect a lot of you can picture yourselves with markers and crayons scattered around you without a care in the world because, after all, there's nothing more important to do then, right? But the reality is, creativity was and still is important, and it's a quality that we can only maintain for as long as we stimulate and challenge ourselves to think outside the box. In 1965, researcher George Land created a test that helped him study creativity, and a big project of his was conducted on a group of 1,600 children. Interestingly enough, his results showed that 98% of the kids aged 3 to 5 scored high enough on that test to be considered creative geniuses. So for all I know, 3-year-old me didn't see fireworks, but instead envisioned a modern rendition of The Starry Night. I mean, I see no difference. But still, I think it's safe to say that my ways of thinking have changed quite a bit since then. When you first saw this painting, what did you see? Take a look at where the kids' creativity lands at the age of 10. Their scores drop from 98 to 32, a 67% decrease. This is by far the most drastic drop on the chart, indicating that the most neurological change occurs at some point during elementary school. And in order to understand that change, it's important to consider some general functions of the human brain. We can break it down into 2 hemispheres, the left and the right, each performing extremely different but important tasks. The left side can be classified as the logical or analytical portion that allows us to comprehend language and process information and whatnot. But then there's the right side, which functions as the creativity center. This is the hemisphere that allows us to recall the tunes to the songs we like or replicate our visual sensations through art media. And that's not to suggest that one of these hemispheres is more or less important than the other when it comes to developing creativity. I mean, our ability to be creative is what determines how we connect ideas in order to solve problems and come to solutions and, in general, approach life. But our creative minds, in order to reach that level of productivity, require that both sides be working in tandem. And unfortunately, due to the ways in which children in America are commonly raised nowadays, this is not our natural frame of mind. When we're young, we don't spend much time exercising that left side, seeing as we don't acquire much knowledge or logic until much later. However, we have plenty of opportunities to develop the imaginative sides of our brains, whether by drawing, painting, playing house, etc. But alas, we grow up and are taught to forget how to access that side of ourselves, and that process begins when we enter school. Typical teenager blaming school for all her problems, but yes, school, the place where we learn how to do simple addition and form proper sentences. And that is where the balance between brain hemispheres begins to shift left, suppressing our creative abilities. In other words, the knowledge we acquire throughout our lives is what teaches us to reject the more complex ways of approaching obstacles later in life. Take this for an example. We were all taught that 2 + 2 = 4 as a general principle of arithmetic. But when I think about it, it seems that this rudimentary concept just makes it that much harder for us to accept that 2 + 5 × 2 divided by 7 + 2 is also 4. I'll spare you the time of doing that in your head. The online graphing calculator agrees with me. But anyways, why are we primarily taught the 2 + 2 method when there are literally infinite other ways of coming to the exact same solution? And it appears to me that the simple answer is because it's easy, it's practical. And yes, I do believe it's necessary to learn the basics first, but then again, who decided that either one of these methods is more simplified than the other? We arrive at the same answer, don't we? It's the minimalistic view that appeals to our senses. But that instilled fear of difficulty and failure is exactly what is discouraging young kids from taking risks or choosing the creative route. And I know that we all have this urge to get through life simply by getting into college, finding a decent job, and settling down. But it's those types of attitudes that are destroying creativity and interpretation. And that's something that I struggled with for quite a while, but eventually I realized that my linear ways of thinking made me just about as qualified to do any job as a computer. And that becomes more and more literal every single day as kids continue to grow up with technology dictating their lives. We think in straight lines. But that mode of thinking is depriving us of so many meaningful skills to be used later in life. But by instilling creativity early on, we can train ourselves to think just as innovatively as some of the most successful business owners in the world, and from a young age too. Because what makes these innovators as successful as they are is their ability to come up with fresh, original ideas. And it just so happens that many of them are also exercising their creative minds. Many businesses, including the ones I just showed you, are now enacting policies similar to the 20% rule, which essentially states that 20% of office hours are to be spent working on personal projects in order to exercise creativity. Because that exposure to creativity is part of what helps these business workers become creative themselves. It was actually during Google's use of this time that they were able to found Gmail and AdSense. So my question is this: if big-name companies as successful as Google are instilling creativity in the workplace, then why is it that in schools, arts programs are almost always the first to go? Right now, there are 1.3 million elementary school students in this country who don't have access to arts education. But without that opportunity, those kids are losing out on some of the most creative years of their lives. In another study by Michigan State University, it was actually determined that people who start or own businesses have most likely received up to 8 times the amount of exposure to the arts as children than the general public. And this link between creativity and success extends beyond the business world as well. Albert Einstein, revolutionary scientist who forever changed the world with his theory of relativity, played the violin throughout his entire childhood. Alexander Graham Bell spent his life studying the piano, Thomas Edison and President Truman as well. So you can see through these examples that there is a direct correlation between balanced, relaxed activity and quality of work, and not just for artists. We have this image ingrained in our minds that we can only become successful if we do well in school, becoming more and more left-minded. But again, it's crucial that we exercise both these areas of our minds together. After all, Aristotle did indeed say, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. But if we don't take initiative now, then I predict that one day we will live in a world where everybody talks, dresses, eats, works, and thinks identically. And that's already happening. I mean, think about social media. Like, how many of you have an Instagram or Snapchat or Facebook account? Okay. Now for all my fellow Gen Zers out there, how many of you have ever seen this? For the rest of you, just know that every teen on social media has either posted this photo or scrolled past it at least 10 times. That one's mine, I couldn't resist. But I think the reason for this is because we're primitively taught to copy what other people do, but one day that's going to be turned around and used against us. According to The Verge, restaurants are even beginning to model their interior designs after popular social media aesthetics. But if we spiral down that path, then we're going to end up slowly stifling thought diversity until it no longer exists. And what happens then? We talk, dress, eat, work, and think identically. You're probably wondering, well, in that case, I want to be creative. How do I do that? And based on numerous studies on creative education, the short answer to that question is practice. The first step is finding the inner motivation necessary to take a risk and break that linear cycle of thinking. Because after all, if we're not willing to expand our horizons, then we will only continue to consider the straightforward courses of action. Here's my theory. I actually don't think that writer's block exists. I think that our minds are in constant states of inspirational rush. It's just that we've trained ourselves to filter out the safest ideas. But by eliminating that filter, we bring ourselves closer to accepting the inevitable truth that not every idea that comes out of our heads has to be perfect, or is going to be perfect for that matter. And coming to that realization is something that happens so rarely, and yet it's also something that's so integral to society. That's why we gravitate toward things like taiyaki. Because it's different, it's fun, it changes the way we think about food. But when us teenagers latch onto those ideas, posting about them over and over again, it becomes the norm. But here's the silver lining. If it only took one person to invent the genius food that combines fish and unicorns, then that means that once we all incorporate creativity into our everyday lives, we will constantly be kept at the edge of our seats. Which brings me to step 2, exposure to creative thinking. As most of you can probably definitely tell, I am a high school student, which means that sometimes in the midst of writing a report or an essay or an article, my mind will just sort of hit a brick wall. And then I panic, of course. I mean, I'm 15 years old, what else am I supposed to do? But eventually, instead of panicking, I started shutting the computer, closing the door, and just singing as loudly and obnoxiously as I possibly can. And I don't just do that to annoy my family. No, I do it because it allows my right brain the time to catch up to the left, so that by the time I go back to finish that paper, there is nothing within my mind preventing my ideas from spilling out. Because every time you reach that point of synchronicity, it opens this endless realm of inspiration and ideas. And once you've achieved that, then the only thing left to do is to repeat that cycle over and over until we've achieved an equilibrium of left and right-minded activity, allowing our minds to become stronger than ever, placing ourselves back in that 98th percentile. Because in the end, if we want to wind up like these people, we may just have to start thinking a bit more like these ones. Thank you.